Hi there. Welcome back to the Real Film Chronicles podcast. As always, I'm Nathan.
And I'm Brian.
And in today's very special episode, we're going to be talking about a little film called Spiderhead.
Spiderhead, a June 2022 movie from Netflix, directed by Joseph Kosinski, starring Chris Hemsworth, Miles Teller, and Journey Smollett, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yep, I think so. I gotta say, though, this was probably the weirdest Spider-Man sequel I've ever seen. Like, do we really need an origin about Spider-Man's head now? Like, this is getting kind of crazy, right?
Yeah. And Thor was not acting very Thorish in this film.
Yeah, kind of like the anti-Thor. I'm assuming it's going to be like, he's going to turn out to be like one of the Skrulls.
It must have something to do with Netflix like losing that Marvel TV show license, right? There's something related there. A prisoner in a state-of-the-art penitentiary begins to question the purpose of the emotion-controlling drugs he's testing for a pharmaceutical genius. So this movie was, pretty interesting. Like, to me, it felt like it just dropped out of the sky. I might have seen one small preview of it about 4 or 5 days before it released on Netflix, like very little fanfare. I'm not sure if that's just, the industry of streaming, but where did this movie come from? Like, how did you fall upon it?
Just kind of randomly. Lately I've been watching, I can't remember the guy's YouTube videos, but he'll go over, I gotta find it and give this guy proper props. Because he'll go over, recent, what are some good sci-fi films on Netflix right now? What are some good new releases on Netflix right now? It was, I heard about this. It came on my radar through a random YouTube video that I was watching late at night while I was falling asleep. And I was like, oh, this is, it was like, okay, John, was it Krasinski? Not Krasinski. That's
Joseph Kosinski. Yeah.
Joseph Kosinski, who did Oblivion, right?
He did Oblivion. He's done a few things you'd be familiar with. Oblivion, which was a Tom Cruise sci-fi film, which I personally loved. Yeah. He did Tron Legacy, which probably a little more divisive in that one. Personally, I loved it.
I thought it was okay. I think I have to go back and rewatch it because watching it's been on, for some reason people have been discussing it recently, and watching just like little clips of it on YouTube was like, this looks super amazing. I was like, I think I need to revisit this because I don't think I gave it maybe a fair shake when I watched it the first time.
Definitely, it's a lot of fun. I thought he also directed Only the Brave. I'm not sure if you've seen that one, but that was also a pretty solid film. I can't remember what I rated it, but very, very good. And most notably, and maybe why people are really on top of Spiderhead right now, is that he directed Top Gun Maverick.
Yes.
And that one obviously in theaters over June, and has been absolutely dominating the box office. Really good film. I don't think you've seen it, so obviously we're not going to say much about it.
Don't spoil it yet.
Kosinski's definitely, like, based on that series of movies right there we just listed off, like really doing a lot of good stuff. Like, this guy is a good director. And with that being said, like, what is your first impressions of Spiderhead? Now let's give a proper spoiler warning here. Let's just go right into spoilers as we do. What are your first impressions of this film?
Well, it was super polished, like from a visual perspective. Like, it didn't feel like some Netflix films have that kind of direct to TV or direct to video feel or quality to them. This one felt like, looking at it like visually and the cinematography, it felt like a big budget movie. It felt like a AAA movie from a studio.
In your research, did you find anything about the actual budget of this movie? Because I couldn't see anything online.
I didn't happen to come across it, but I think it wasn't like indie levels of budget. It was like a healthy budget, if I recall.
Yeah, it would have been a lot of money. It definitely shows on screen here.
Yeah, it definitely shows. It was a really cool idea. There's a neat idea, I thought. And then about 2/3 of the way through the movie, it really just kind of not fell apart, but just the whole thing kind of fell flat for me. It was like it was building up to something,
Yeah.
but then it just like kind of petered out at the end. And I think maybe partially because this was based on a short story originally. And so I think like short story has to be, you have to expand it out to fill, 150 or 160 page screenplay or whatever it is, or 90 page screenplay. It's not that long of a movie. But I felt
it runs in at about 107 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. 107 minutes. It felt longer than that.
It did.
And I think it was because one of the challenges of adapting a short story into like a feature length film is like you have to add more content. And I think that's where you see something like Arrival, which was based on a short story, which was, expanded out a little bit. And you really see the talents of, screenwriters adapting with the adapted screenplay from existing properties. And like that is a real talent. And I don't think that they quite pulled it off here. It was kind of started off strong, but really disappointing in the end for me. I don't know. How did you feel about this one, Brian?
Yeah, honestly, I think our feelings are probably pretty mutual on this one. This film fell a little flat for me, but it definitely has a very strong like first act. I don't know when the acts begin and end, but I'll just say it had a very strong first act. And I think that's a trapping of a lot of sci-fi movies because it's very conceptual in nature. And I find that is sometimes enough to propel a sci-fi story all the way through. And in this case, it not the situation. It did not really stick the landing. And really, I don't know. I felt like I knew where the movie was going the entire time. There was a little reveal like halfway through that didn't have me in too much shock or anything, but it's just like, okay. And nothing really excited me that was going on in this movie. And it was flat, really. I have no better word for it there. What did you think of that twist halfway through the movie? And the twist is basically Chris Hemsworth's character is running this, it's kind of like this prison where prisoners have volunteered to undergo testing of different drugs and have their pharmaceuticals, yeah. And the results are recorded and controlled by Chris Hemsworth's character. And then we find out halfway through that he also is taking his own experimental drugs. Like he's totally in on it. And these drugs like range in all sorts of different like heightened emotions, emotional states and different effects on the human body where you kind of just lose control. What did you think of that with that twist? Because I saw one article that I felt like was really reaching as saying that was like the hidden depth of this movie is that he was taking his own drugs.
Well, there was a couple twists in this. This is the thing, when you start trying to write twists and big reveals, you really it's a calculated risk, right? Because you run the risk of like, oh, this isn't really as shocking as you think it might be, or maybe like it doesn't really it's not really tied into the character development and the narrative development to the extent that maybe you think it is. This was definitely not up there with like Sixth Sense level twists. There was a couple twists. The one you mentioned was like, oh yeah, he's taking his own drugs because of his philosophy. That is Chris Hemsworth, who played, I don't know, the pharmaceutical company. He was actually the CEO of the company. Yeah.
His name's Steven.
Steve. It's like, yeah,
Steve,
call me Steve or call me Steven, because like Miles Teller, aka the odometer, wouldn't call him Steve throughout the whole thing, right? Kept calling him.
Sorry, the odometer?
Let's joke online. People keep saying like his name, like Miles Teller. It's like, actually, correction is like it's called an odometer. Oh. I stole that joke from Twitter. I stole that joke from Twitter. I apologize. That was
no
Miles the odometer.
Embrace it. Embrace it and run with it. Okay.
But yeah, so one thing is like his philosophy is like, well, I have to know what the actual effects are, so I'm going to take these drugs as well when they get to a certain point in the testing phase where he feels like they're safe enough. So there is a little bit of commentary there. And then later on, where I think, what is it like? I something or B, whatever, however he names the drug. It's based on a bingo card where he's naming the drugs, which is a weird thing. What I thought was like, is this going to have like more implication in the story other than he's just like treating it as a game, I guess, maybe.
It was just a way for him to like keep track of the stuff. It was
Yeah.
like if drugs were like N17, if that was like a specific drug, and it was like checking them off when they became like safe to take or were effective.
When they got to like a certain point of efficacy, I think. And then the other big twist is like there's one drug that essentially can make people do whatever you tell them to do. So like that kind of almost the mind control drug. And that was like all the other drugs essentially were like in service of testing the efficacy of this one drug that could control people's minds. And like, it was interesting, like Chris Hemsworth's character, Steve, the CEO, he wasn't like a raving bad guy. He had actually like, he had good intentions. Like, I want to like create world peace and world harmony. Of course, he was going to do it through nefarious means of like drugging the entire population and telling them what to do and how to behave and how to think. But something about it, the way it came off, the reveal was just kind of, it fell a little flat. I know the kind of social commentary they were trying to make, but it didn't work. It didn't have the depth. There was some je ne sais quoi that was missing from the writing and the character development that you really needed to get from like point A to point B. There needed to be some more kind of connective tissue. I don't know. I didn't feel like I was given enough narratively or story wise to start to empathize with Chris Hemsworth's character at all, or to empathize with his goals. It felt a little bit cartoony maybe by the end, even though they're trying to obviously give him more depth, but it did feel a little bit cartoon villainy.
You know what, 100%. Now that you mentioned that, there is a scene where they are giving this drug, and what was it called? Flabbergast or Frankengast? Darkenfloxx.
Which sounds like a designer drug sponsored by IKEA, right? It's like, right? Give him the Darkenfloxx, yeah.
So they give it to this poor lady, and she accidentally. So this drug like makes you go ballistic, like it makes you afraid of things, and like
that was a different one. Darkenfloxx was just
was a different one.
Darkenfloxx just made you feel intense pain like you've never felt before.
Oh, that's right.
There was another one that made you like afraid of stuff. It was probably like fear and glocks or something. I don't know. I can't remember what the name of it was. Fear and Foofle.
As she's pumped full of this Darkenfloxx and is in extreme pain, she's kind of like bashing herself around the room because of the pain. And it's important to note that the drugs aren't administered like through pills or anything. They are attached basically to the bottom of your spine, like right on your back is like this device that you can just put the drugs in, and then he can remotely control with his iPhone.
There's an app for that.
There's an app for it, 100%. Which was just like, give me a break. But so basically she breaks the device that's on her back, and it unleashes way too much of this drug into her system. And the cartoony part is when Steve is running to this test room. So they're separated by like a glass, like one-way glass.
Yeah.
And you think, well, there must just be like one doorway here. And the assistant does go there very quickly. But when Steve figures out, oh my goodness, I just left the other prisoner, Miles, in my room with all my secrets, he starts running back. But he has to sprint. He's sprinting back, and he's sprinting through the whole facility. And it was like, what kind of moment is this? Like, he's not that far away, but no, he has to go out into the hallways. He's running into random people in the hallways, and he's trying to get back to his room. And
like, who designed this place? Why wouldn't the test room be right next to the observation room? Why do that?
It's like they were sharing a wall already, but that wall was only glass, I guess, and they could not put a door in there. It was very, very strange. But stuff like that, was definitely quite cartoony, now that you said that. The writers of this movie, Rhett Reese and Paul Wernick, I did look this up because, the writing, it's got a little lackluster here, right? These two guys wrote the Deadpool movies.
Oh, okay.
They wrote the two Zombieland movies.
Oh.
Movie Life.
Okay.
Jake Gyllenhaal. I don't know if you saw that one.
I haven't seen that one yet, no.
They partnered up with Michael Bay at one point to write Six Underground. And then they wrote one of the G.I. Joe films. I'm not sure which one Retaliation is, but I assume it's one of the...
no idea. I don't even know how many G.I. Joe films there are. Like, were there one or two or three, 4? I know there was
I think
Snake
it might be
Eyes.
3. You know
Was that
what?
spin-offs?
That's a good point. I bet you there's G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe Retaliation, and then there's Snake Eyes like 10 years later.
Okay.
That's my bet. In any event, how do we feel about
Oh man,
Miles Teller in this movie? Like, was he good? Is that an actor that you
yeah.
kind of seek
Honestly,
out every so often?
ever since for me, his performance in Whiplash.
Oh yes,
I will check out anything this kid does. And it's weird, like all these people are like all these actors are like younger than us now. It's a weird. It's like yeah, this kid's going places. But no, like Miles Teller, I think I've read places that I don't know, different accounts. Like some things I've read is like he's super difficult to work with. He gets super intense on roles, and other places that he's a great human being. All the behind the scenes stuff, I don't know. I'm not equipped to comment on, but like in terms of performance on screen, I think he's going to be one of the great ones for his generation. I think.
Yeah, without a doubt, he's like just looking at some of his filmography. I kind of forget. It's not an actor that I think of very often when I think about my favorite actors or I'm seeking movies that a certain actor has done. But he's done a lot of really good stuff, and he's paired up with Kosinski a couple of times. He was in Only the Brave, and he was in Top Gun Maverick as well. Probably, I feel like the first time I remember seeing him was in War Dogs, which
how was it?
Was an interesting film.
With Jonah Hill, right?
Yeah, with Jonah Hill, it was pretty decent. Probably in that same vein as Lord of War with Nick Cage.
I was literally just gonna say, like, I got a Lord of War vibe from the trailers I'd seen.
Yeah, definitely, but not quite as polished as Lord of War, but still pretty good.
Was he in The Card Counter, or am I misremembering that? I don't know if you checked that
Card
out
Counter
last year
with Oscar Isaac.
Yeah,
I'm gonna say no because I don't see it in his list here.
Okay, I'm misremembering. There was another younger actor in that same generation as Miles Teller. There's a couple I get confused with. I think Ty Sheridan. For some reason, I get confused between him and Ty Sheridan.
Okay, yeah.
all these all these. I don't know. It's weird. Like there's a bunch of like there's 3 or 4 white kids who look the same.
Yeah.
I keep getting. Speaking as a white person here, there's for some reason Miles Teller and Ty Sheridan, and there's a couple others. Like I will get them mixed up in my mind. I don't know if they look super similar, right, but for some reason I just like they tend to blend together sometimes. But I think Miles Teller is really with recent movies, he's becoming kind of a bit more like he's sticking in my mind a bit more. This might be just a function of my age as well. Like they say the memory is the first thing to go, right?
And a movie like this almost seems like a bit of a side project. Like I assume that
It does.
Actually, I did look it up. They filmed it in November of 2020.
So did they film this after Top Gun Maverick then?
I believe so, because Top Gun Maverick was slated to come out in 2020 and was pushed back like a full 2 years until this year to release.
I'd forgotten about that actually, yeah.
So I figure this one was filmed, and then again, Netflix was just deciding when to cash in on it, and what better time to cash in than right after when Top Gun comes out. It's like, oh, if you like this actor in Top Gun, go check out Spiderhead. But
same actor, same director. It makes sense that they're like riding on the tails of like the huge, massive success of Top Gun Maverick, releasing the next Joseph Kosinski movie. To get that name recognition, because like I think you and we knew who Joseph Kosinski was beforehand, but I don't think he's really for the general movie going audience. I don't think that would be like a household director name, right? Like in the same way that like Scorsese or Spielberg or even like Guillermo del Toro might be recognized. I don't like Joseph Kosinski might not be on a lot of people's top 10 lists, but maybe he should be.
Possibly. I mean, I'm a little undecided after watching Spiderhead. I did like, but you have a huge star power with Chris Hemsworth. I mean, this guy's on top of the world right now, obviously in no small part thanks to the MCU, but he's also been in another Netflix film. I believe it was Extraction. There's
an Extraction 2 coming out. Extraction again was another one, Netflix film, really, really polished, felt really polished. interesting setup. The action was really good actually in Extraction. Like it felt like really, really visceral, and you could feel the hits when people were getting hit in that one.
Yeah.
Like you'd feel it, but then it just like it felt like almost like the Spiderhead, where it's like it felt like half a film. They had like an idea up front, but they weren't sure almost where to go with it or how to end it off.
This has to be an ongoing issue. I think I mentioned before, like sci-fi, like short story sci-fi. This short story was published in 2010, I think I saw, or even 2013. So it's a fairly recent one. And the beauty of a short story like that, you can spend time with the setup because, like, I love sci-fi, but I think I just love picturing these alternate worlds and future societies and the conceptual stuff. I'm kind of reminded of The Island by Michael Bay, which, we've been watching Michael Bay movies recently because of our upcoming podcast episode on it. But it's like The Island, the same thing where these people are basically imprisoned in this weird kind of facility.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of weird stuff going on in there, but it was also the most fascinating part of the movie. Like the last half of The Island kind of turned into more of a generic chase action film, which is what it is. But this is the same kind of thing where once the reveal of of what's going on here, and that, Steve is a bad person and acting, outside the, proper ethics, it's not really that interesting anymore. And I think the big thing here is watching the trailer. I got everything I needed to out of the trailer of this movie, including like the first act where they fall under the spell of like the love drug, which makes them go wild with passion, right? It's like that was a big hook in the trailer. And you're thinking, oh, if that's one of the drugs, what else are they going to give them? There was another sequence where Miles is flown out to somewhere to look at like an industrial garbage heap. He's given this drug, and he basically sees nothing but pure beauty, and he loves everything he's seeing. It's just like, oh, isn't that nice? But it's not nearly as interesting as like, a passion love drug and finding the long-term effects of something like that. It's just like, this is just a hallucinatory drug, which isn't that far off from our own reality.
Yeah. Well, like the one drug that they never really talked about in the movie is like the one that like stimulated your cognitive abilities and made you a lot more articulate and like almost like boosted your cognitive abilities. Like how are you not talking about that? Why aren't you taking that one to like essentially like make you smarter all the time?
Well, wouldn't that have been interesting if one of them got that drug and like found a way to actually escape from this prison? Because they're all prisoners. And I think the short story was originally called Escape from Spiderhead. And it's like, they didn't really escape as much as they just tore the whole place to the ground.
See, that would have been an interesting story about like, risking addiction, because you need to get the supply of drugs to boost your cognitive abilities, to think of the plan to escape, but then you risk potentially addiction, or you risk frying your brain or something. Like that would have been an interesting. You just hit on a more interesting story there, Brian.
And then you just brought up addiction. It's like, again, I'm going back to that love drug where he wanted to observe the people who had taken it to see if after a few days, like there's still remnants of it. Are they still in love?
Yeah. Is it long-term effects, or is it just only when the drug is in your system, right?
And that was the only one they really explored. And it was like, no, it wasn't a thing. But there's all these other drugs. And it's like, yeah, maybe there's a whole crew of people here where he's trying to say, well, because you were on this experimental drug, your sentence is lessened and you can go back to regular prison for a month and you're done. And you would have people fighting to stay inside this place to keep on the drugs. That would also be kind of interesting.
Oh, yeah. Like the thing was like, oh, we're faking our results. It's like, oh, yeah. It's like, no, I don't feel anything for anybody. It's like, give me more drugs.
Yeah, exactly. But it was very like on the nose, like very,
also you just poked a whole hole in their methodology, like in the scientific methodology. It's like, of course, because people were talking about, it's like, oh, one of the things was, if you don't cooperate, you're going to be sent back to the general population at prison. I was like, well, that's just like, that gives people motivation to give you the answers that you think you want to hear. You just, you completely invalidated all their scientific research with like 10 seconds of thought.
Yeah, that's, I guess it helps that like the whole thing is that the big reveal is essentially that this was not very scientific process that this guy was following. It's like, I think there was only really the two staff members, Steve and his assistant, who eventually grows a conscience at the end of the movie.
Verlaine? Does that make sense?
Yeah, Mark Verlaine. Yeah, I did see something about that. So Mark Verlaine played by Mark Peguio. I might be butchering that name, and I apologize. But I think I read a trivia where his name was Verlaine in the short story, but they called him Mark throughout this entire movie. And it was like, was that just a mistake? I feel like the trivia was insinuating it was a mistake in just calling him Mark because the actor's name is Mark. And that was never in the actual story that his name was Mark. But in any event, Mark Verlaine grows a conscience.
Yeah, and it really, really suddenly grows a conscience. This is the thing. There was so much stuff where it's like characters doing the things they needed to do in order to move the plot along, not because it made sense. Like Mark's turn, his conscience, like they had a couple of things where he was questioning, but like to all of a sudden turn on his friend and give control over to one of the inmates of
right, which is also kind of bad.
It was a huge turn. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to leave and leave the door open behind me so you can escape. It's like, no, I'm going to literally give you access to the app to control Steve's drugs. He gave that to, what's Miles Teller's character's name? Jeff Boy, mullet Jeff. Which I gotta give props to Miles Teller's mullet in this. It was a pretty glorious mullet as far as mullets go.
It's one of those futuristic prison mullets.
One of them, their futuristic prison mullets.
Listen, were there any themes that you were able to pick up on, like any hidden context that we might be missing out on here, that I missed out on
like
while watching this movie?
All the obvious themes that were essentially like they beat you over the head with a sledgehammer. It's like, yeah, corporate greed. Corporate greed is bad. It's like, okay, yeah, pharmaceuticals, trying to control people's emotions through drugs is bad. It's like, okay, I guess if you're gonna show like a video to like grade 5 kids, it's like, it feels like, you know, when you used to get those like instructional videos about drugs when we were kids, it's like, don't do drugs, don't do marijuana, or you'll end up living in the streets soaking your own urine, or whatever it was. It's like, it felt like that level of nuance to the messaging. There was like, obviously in a movie like this, they're going to touch on like, the ethics of scientific experimentation on people, which is like, but like it was so obviously wrong from the beginning, and it was so obviously wrong for him to be taking for Steve, aka Chris Hemsworth, to be taking untested, not peer-reviewed drugs, and just like it was so obviously wrong, the things he was doing, that there was like no nuance to it. It's like, of course, you knew from the very beginning, when he was like forcing people to have sex with each other against their will, essentially forcibly raping people is what it was, due to drugs, and then like forcing people to torture each other, forcing that one guy to just like eat until he was so full he threw up and then kept eating. Like, it's like, well, awful. You mean the guy who's been doing terrible stuff to people is the bad guy? Is like, well, color me shocked. Like, I had no idea that Chris Hemsworth was going to be the bad guy in this. Like, wow.
And they do try to make him quite charming, right? Like, it's just like he's trying to be buddies with Miles Teller or Jeff, I guess.
Yeah, that was purely Chris Hemsworth, right? Who is like, you've seen him. He's got the charisma, right? He's got hugely charismatic leading man. He can win people over. I think a huge part of the success of like the Thor movies, it's Chris Hemsworth, right? He's got that charm and the comedy down now, but even he couldn't. It was purely resting on his shoulder. The only reason it worked at all was purely because of Chris Hemsworth in that role. He was elevating that material and that character more than it had any right to be. And then there was just like other ridiculous elements of the plot, right, that just didn't make sense. Like the drug packs that we're led to assume, because like they're implanted at the base of the back, like they're hooked in directly to their spine and their nervous system, I'm assuming. But like they were ridiculously easy to break. Like the protective housing mine's well been made out of Legos for all the good it did. I mean, they broke so easy.
That one really bothered me. Like when she was writhing around the room and just smashed it, and that basically caused a catastrophic failure, was just like, well, these are prisoners, and a lot of them have quite violent pasts.
They're quite violent. Why would you... Like the big guy with the tattoos, right? Was like, he was ready to break some spines there.
And this device is huge. I guess it's just that they're counting on that motivation to not,
but they were even saying like, be careful when like we put that other love drug in you when you're having sex. It's like if you're too wild, it might break the pack on your back. It's like, But it was weird.
Yeah.
Like for the first half of the movie, it come to play at all, and the second half of the movie, like every second drug pack was just breaking. It was as soon as you touched it with your pinky, right? It was just like doing exactly what the plot needed it to do, which would be fine if it wasn't just so blatant that like everybody's pack was breaking all the time when the plot needed it to happen, and then it stopped working long enough. Like when Chris Hemsworth's character Steve, his pack gets broken, in a completely no due disrespect to Miles Teller, but in a fight between Miles Teller and Chris Hemsworth, even looking at them on the screen, it was like looking at like a 12-year-old and a full-grown adult. It's like there's no way. It didn't look believable that Miles Teller could have held his own against. It looked like Chris Hemsworth was still in Thor shape for that. He looked massive.
Probably.
It's like this didn't look like. Anyway, that's again. It's like it's nitpicky, I guess.
So here's something else about these drug packs, and this is maybe another nitpick about the drug packs. But I think there were 5 like vials inside of it, right?
Yeah.
I was under the impression that each vial is its own drug.
It
Were
is.
the vials there as a mixture? Because remember, the bingo card is like five letters, but wouldn't it be awful to have to go to your prisoners before their experiment and be like, well, listen, we got to change out a couple of these vials on this pack to give you the right ones when you're in the testing room, instead of just giving them like a pill or even like a quick shot of liquid to drink? Or maybe it just seemed really strange. It wasn't clear cut if it was just a combination of these 5 different chemicals for each drug.
A needlessly complicated delivery system, and it almost felt like it's like, oh, we need to show like this is happening in the modern world. We need to show this happening in an app on a smartphone. It's like, wouldn't you have like a dedicated device? Would you really just run it on an app on your smartphone when you're like people's lives are on the line?
It really was. I mean, it was just an app sitting there right beside Angry Birds, right?
And really, like if you look at the screen, it's like if you just dragged your finger a little bit too far, it's like there was a specific range. It's like, oh, this is like lethal or dangerous range. Like if you just like happened to sneeze or something when you were dragging your finger around the app, you could like kill somebody that easy. It's like there's got to be a better UX design for this app. The whole thing just felt like a little bit cartoony, like in the worst possible way. I don't know, like some of that stuff is like.
Are you tempted to go out and read the original short story that this movie was based on?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not like this is the whole thing. Cause like you were saying, like high concept idea of this is like, it's a really interesting concept, and I'm sure it has enough content for a short story. This feels like something straight out of like, like a Philip K. Dick kind of style short story. Or I'm thinking of, what is it? Is it A Scanner Darkly? I think deals with some similar subject matter in terms of I think there's a drug there, and it's people not exactly the same. I don't think it's mind control, but it drew some similarities for me anyway. There was drugs involved. I guess that's enough of a similarity for my brain to make. But yeah, I'm super interested to read what the original source material is now. I'm definitely gonna search it out.
I did see some comments online that said this would probably have made a much better Black Mirror episode that was like an hour or an hour and 10 minutes long. Right. Well, I can't help but agree.
It makes sense because Black Mirror, every episode boils down to technology bad. So this would have been a perfect technology bad kind of setup for them.
Listen, did you have anything else to add before we talk about ratings on this movie?
Nothing stood out. I think... Once again, I think there's a common theme in some of our reviews where it's like we're giving props to the actors, and like the issues we're having with the movie is not with the acting. The actors were all great.
Like I almost want one day to say, yeah, the acting was really bad in this movie, but this one in particular, and I just want to read this quote. It was from Rotten Tomatoes. It was like the summary where it said, Spiderhead's top shelf cast and well-written source material are almost enough to compensate for its frequent failure to live up to its potential.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think nobody's having a problem with the cast here. Yeah. Really, everyone did a great job there.
That sums it up with like, didn't feel like there was enough content to fill out an hour and a half movie. It didn't feel like there was enough, like, in terms of like, the movie I think was trying to be deep. It felt like a first year philosophy student who was like getting high with his friends and trying to say like really deep and profound things, but didn't quite get to that level. I think as deep and profound as they thought it was. Everything was very surface level. All subtext was text. Yeah, it was a disappointment overall. Except the other thing too is like it looked gorgeous though. Like it looked
It did, yeah.
especially when you got some of those wide shots when they were outside. Yeah, like it looked amazing. Cast was great. Writing, themes, narrative, just like it was super super thin, and yeah.
So with all that being said, what is your Letterboxd rating? And sorry, what is your rating? And to just remind listeners, we use the Letterboxd scale of 5 stars with a possibility of a little heart icon that might go the extra mile towards the film.
Yeah, I think I gave this one, if I'm recalling correctly, I think it was a 2 out of 5 star rating. It wasn't the worst movie I've ever seen, but it just felt maybe not aggressively mediocre, just straight up just mediocre. Didn't quite get to the
I like
average.
that term though. Aggressively mediocre.
Yeah, there are some other movies that I think would fit better. This one was just like plain old mediocre. It's like, yeah, you get your 40%. Yeah, this is not like a modern classic or a hidden gem that people are going to be revisiting for years to come. This was a one and done Netflix special riding the coattails of Kosinski's larger success with Top Gun, trying to draw up some viewership with that brand. Or I hate to refer to a person as a brand, but with that familiarity with the director and the main actors, right?
Without a doubt.
How about you?
Yeah, I am landing at 2 stars as well, the exact same rating. This really was pretty lackluster. I had trouble focusing on it long term. Like, it was just watch it for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and it's just out my brain the next day. I had to really brush up on some research to remind myself of what went on during this movie. I don't think I'll ever seek out this movie ever again. And what's really disappointing for me is that I love Kosinski's films.
Yeah.
Like, I'm looking at that little lineup of movies, and I wouldn't be surprised if all of them are 4 or 4.5 stars and above. And to have this movie reaching in at 2 stars just kind of hurts. Like, not all directors can make every single film a stellar film, and this is a case in point. And it's not even like offensively bad or anything. It's just it's just a little lower than mediocre for me. It's just lackluster and kind of disappointing because I want more out of my sci-fi.
Well, listen, I watched this. I was recovering from COVID, and I was still kind of a little bit out of it. It was a Sunday afternoon, and this movie, I think, captured that feeling of being partially sick on a Sunday afternoon. That was the feeling I got from Spiderhead. Yeah. It kind of encapsulated that feeling, that experience perfectly.
Man, could you imagine going to a facility and just being like experimented on like daily with wild drugs? Like, it's not just like simple drugs. Like, these drugs are wild. Like, how awful you would feel day to day. But these people were also living in like luxurious. I mean, were they even living in cells? I mean, they had shared kitchens with all the modern amenities.
It was pretty open.
They looked pretty
especially
comfortable.
Like, apparently Darkenfloxx, like Miles Teller's character Jeff there, he was scarred for life after having been injected with Darkenfloxx one time.
Yeah.
So like some of these drugs are like, yes, well, and some of them is like, it sounds good on the surface, like, oh yeah, the love drug, where it's like it made you incredibly attracted to whoever was in the room with you, but essentially it's like you're being forced to have sex against your will. So it's like when you afterwards, like you could tell, it's like he felt like dirty and degraded afterwards, right? He didn't want to talk about it. It's like he went to the room next, and he's like, you could tell by the way, credit to Miles Teller, getting that emotion across. It's like, yeah, he felt degraded. It's like, so even like the ones that seem good on the surface are just like, yeah, there's like, there were no good drugs.
Well, I think the only good one was the one that made everything look beautiful to you. And that one, I mean, basically, I don't know, did he do it on purpose? So basically, Steve, Chris Hemsworth's character, is piloting a small plane off this little area. I don't know if it was an isolated island, but he's over the water, and he's full of these drugs because his little drug pack is all busted up too from previous
he's getting
events.
Like every drug simultaneously.
And he basically starts flying directly at this island mountain, and he's just entranced with the beauty of it and just flies directly into it, and he's dead. It's just end of story right
Again,
there.
pointing out how scary this drug is. Like, oh, it makes everything beautiful, even if you're told to walk off the edge of a cliff. It's like, oh, I'll do it because like, oh, look at how beautiful the water is down there. It's like, I'll walk off this cliff, no problem.
Yeah. Yeah, everything is
making
is
people
bad,
docile and compliant. It's like, yeah, all the drugs in this is like there were no good drugs. Like Like in real life, there's some good drugs.
Just like
No,
in
wait.
real life, there's no good drugs except for the ones that the doctors give you.
Yeah, exactly, kids. Don't do drugs. This is our PSA episode.
Yeah, don't do drugs, but like even people as charming as Chris Hemsworth on the street corner, not giving you the right drugs.
Don't do any
Don't
drugs
trust
from Chris Hemsworth is the message here.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Real Film Chronicles podcast. Thank you for listening and hanging out with us today. We really appreciate your support and look forward to you joining us for the next episode. We can be found around the internet and social media, with our home base being realfilmchronicles.com, which will have all the links you need to follow and keep in touch with us. Until next time, take care of yourself and others, and keep your film journey going.